Everybody's had.
Should we go ahead and get started? Okay. All right. Thank you all for coming to our first and maybe our last, I don't know, fashion event at the Carlson School of Management. So thank you guys for showing up for the panel. Thank you to everybody who showed up during the day to work in the factory, including the students in the Funds Enterprise Program who were told that they had no choice. This was an assignment, but they did it, so thank you. This is a lot of students submitted questions ahead of time, and I just created a word cloud out of all of the questions that you guys submitted. So it's basically the things that are on your mind. We wanted to start actually, instead of starting with introducing the panel, we want to just spend a few minutes unpacking the event that we did today. And I'm going to just go to this first slide here. So for those of you who were not here during the day, basically we had all of these different clothes from the Goodwill outlet. We did try to choose things that we thought weren't going to go anyplace, right? We didn't want to choose things that actually we thought had some life left in them. And what we did out there during the day was we first of all sorted everything by country of origin, because we thought it's like that's kind of the first step in figuring out where our clothing comes from. And obviously it's just the final country. There may have been 3 or 4 or even 5 other countries that are somewhere in the supply chain. But we sorted all of the clothing by country. And I just want to start with, this is going to be interactive from the beginning. So if you guys think you're going to snooze off during the first 40 minutes, no, that's not good. Any surprises, like when you look at this sort of country of origin table, what jumps into mind? Any thoughts? Yes, Simon.
I was surprised that we had clothes that were made in the US.
I was too. There were 2 articles of clothing made in the US. Yes, yes, sir.
Sri Lanka, no, it struck out to me.
That we had any, or there was.
Yeah, actually they make clothing. I mean, it's such a small island.
Yeah, yeah. What other observations just from looking at this data? Anything else? Yeah. China, by far, most of the clothing in this selection was from China. What else? I have just one observation that I'll share. I personally was really surprised at how many different countries were represented. I mean, this is much more than I was expecting. I was expecting it would be about a dozen. It's probably twice that.
Yeah, no, I'll just add to this by saying, I think even though we are just seeing the end location where these clothes are made, there is a good chance that some of these items actually crisscross multiple countries, right? So it might have started in US, went to Texas, or went to China, and then went to India. So there is a chance that many of these clothing that we wear today actually crisscross multiple national boundaries as well.
So things that we wanted to basically jump into today are thinking about the climate impacts and thinking about the human rights impacts of the supply chain issues. So climate impacts. Any thoughts on what goes into the climate impacts? Then we'll go to our panel for some of this later. But if you think about what might be embedded in the climate impacts, what do you think about? Yes, sir.
Yeah, the materials that are being used are not biodegradable. So
okay, yep. So I mean, some of the materials are themselves, polyester, which is made from carbon. Yeah. Yep. What else?
It's about the chemical waste.
Chemical waste is
chemical waste.
yes.
Yes, go ahead.
The different carbon emissions that goes into creating the products.
So carbon, chemicals.
So basically the electricity or the factories in those particular countries. And we know that in terms of the carbon emissions of some of the factories in India, for example, significantly higher use of coal than in the US at this point. So the carbon emissions of that article of clothing produced there are going to be higher than if the clothing were produced here. Yes. What else? There's one more that I'm thinking of. Yeah, Mimi.
I know that a lot of the clothes for fast fashion companies end up in landfills.
Okay, yes, absolutely. That's a huge part of the impact. Yes, sir. Impact.
I don't know, distance traveled.
Yeah, so shipping costs are kind of a big thing. So all of those things get embedded into sort of the impact, if not the price, right? And that's one of the issues with carbon emissions, and we talk about that in our class a lot, that is a negative externality. The production of this clothing is creating an economic impact that is not borne, it's not included in the price of those clothes. And that the fact that it's not included in the price of those clothes leads to overconsumption, right?
So far I've been hearing more of the environmental side, right? Anything that comes to you from a social standpoint when you think of apparel supply chains.
Cheap labor, you got a lot of countries out there, and I think it's easy to move from one manufacturing facility to another.
Good point.
So FDI incentive with the policy and tax avoidance from the country of origins in order to attract more and more investment in that.
So I maybe want to, can we unpack that one question, just that one issue a little bit, which is the labor question? So one of the things that you'll hear a lot from people in my business is like, well, because of the growth of the fashion industry in many of these countries have been pulled out of abject poverty. Right? Poverty levels are down, standard of living is up. Would you guys agree with that that's happened? Yeah, Rachel's like, yeah, right.
I don't know statistics. I mean, I think in this whole business, two things can be true at the same time. So
Thank you. Yes.
life expectancy in places like Bangladesh has gone up at least over a decade. But at the same time, this industry is one of the most exploitative in terms of labor. So maybe it has pulled parts of the population out of poverty, but it is incredibly exploitative, and there is a lot of money rising to the very, very top for very, very few people. So
Correct. So I've got a chart here. This is the per capita GDP of Bangladesh. And you can see like, okay, significant growth since 2008, right? Or it looks kind of huge. This is Bangladesh versus South Korea. And so, yes, it is true that there are fewer people in poverty in Bangladesh, and also that's not the whole story. So the exploitative piece of the garment industry actually keeps the entire economy from doing better than it could. And I choose South Korea in part because in 1960, South Korea and Bangladesh both had exactly the same per capita GDP. And South Korea chose a very different path to economic development than Bangladesh has. And I mean, I think the results kind of speak for themselves. So both can be true. You've got to hold two thoughts in your head.
Well, and I would just also add that for many of these workers in a place like Bangladesh, there are no other jobs.
Yes.
These are the only jobs these are the only opportunities that exist for many of them.
And so the choice then is, well, I guess it's better than starving to death. But I might get caught in a fire or have a building fall on me. So for those of you who participated in the event today, any observations from having actually participated in deconstructing our clothes and creating, by the way, these are examples of the work that we created. Students spent all day working on this. It was a little bit freeform. So any thoughts or observations from students who participated in this today? Everyone's like, well, we did it because we had to. Yeah.
I mean, I enjoyed relearning how to use a sewing machine.
That was
Nice.
like a cool skill that I remember learning in middle school. That was kind of neat.
Latent. Yes, there were a few people like, oh yeah, I had this in 6th grade. So, good, that's nice. Any other thoughts? Yes, Mimi.
So for me, I like have my own clothes and stuff, but this was very like unserious because like I didn't feel like I had anything to mess up. But when I like notice when I sew my own clothes, I get really like anxious because I'm like I only have this one article of clothing. If I mess it up, like I can't like add back fabric or anything. Like I can like cut it.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, if you screw up, that's it. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Anybody observe the amount of mechanical issues that we had? This was a very real exercise. I won't say that it had anything to do with the skill of our workers. I'm sure it was just machines, but probably I would say a good 50% of the day the factory was down because we were trying to like untangle something. So lots of mechanical issues. And that's kind of, I don't know what the number is, but that's a real issue that if you're in a factory, you gotta deal with it. So
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's probably one of the most labor-intensive industries in the world, and that has a lot to do with what we will discuss today.
all right. Any other thoughts from the day? If not, then we're gonna turn to having our panel introduce themselves, and then we'll start with like the actual panel part of it. Other questions? And by the way, as we go through the panel discussion, please jump in. If there's a question that you have related to something someone is saying, please do not be shy. Just jump in right then. If you wait till the end, that you might forget or might not be relevant. So please jump in. Okay, we're going to start in the order that I have them, which is Rachel. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why are you here?
Sure, absolutely. I'm a visual artist, so in some ways this is a unlikely place for me to be. For many years, I have worked with a sewing machine as a drawing tool. And when the Rana Plaza factory collapse happened, I could only imagine what it would feel like to have the floor of my studio, which is in Northeast Minneapolis. I'm on the 4th floor of an old warehouse, what it would feel like for the floor of my studio to fall out from under me. And as somebody who has a strong commitment to social justice, I decided that I wanted to investigate this further. But also I'm Jewish, and my family immigrated to this country at the turn of the century. And I connected the Rana Plaza factory collapse to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which happened in 1911 in New York City. It was a factory in Lower Manhattan on the Lower East Side, well, now in the West Village. And there was a fire and 146, mainly women, died. Many of them were Jewish and Italian immigrants. And so when the Rana Plaza factory collapse happened, I was like, wait a minute, this is more than 100 years ago. How could these two things take place? How could the Rana Plaza factory collapse happen, especially when so many protections, so many laws were passed after the Triangle Shirtwaist fire to support workers' rights and safety? And that led me into a lot of research into Bangladesh and the Rana Plaza factory collapse. When I was in Bangladesh, I went to the public cemetery where there are over 100 bodies that have never been identified beyond their DNA. Either that's because families could not afford to come to Dhaka or to Savar to claim their bodies, or just because whole families perished in the collapse. More than 1,000 people died. So that led me to think about a piece that I created, which was called Shroud, which was 1,238 or so white shirts representing the number of people who died in the Rana Plaza factory collapse and the Triangle Shirtwaist fire. So I had to come up with the shirts. And initially I thought I would go to the Salvation Army, but even at $5 a shirt, I realized that was not going to be enough, or I was going to be very expensive to make that piece. So that's what led me to the Goodwill Outlet. So I'm assuming, but maybe not, many of you don't realize that only about between 10 and 20% of what we donate to used clothing stores can actually be resold. And the Goodwill Outlet is the last stop before they get packed in a container and either sent to the landfill or sent overseas to places where they end up in landfills in these other countries. So this, I'm explaining to you kind of how my experience of making art has led me to understand this problem in a more visceral way and has really motivated me to be dedicated to bringing attention to this problem, and also for us to understand what we can do as citizens to help solve it, because we're all implicated because we wear these clothes.
Great.
Thanks, Rachel.
You guys sat in order too. Great, Maxine.
Hi, everybody. I'm Maxine Bédon. I am sitting here today. I am the author of a book called Unraveled, The Life and Death of a Garment, where I was able to travel around the world following a pair of jeans from Texas to China, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, back to the US, to Salvation Army, went to the landfill, spent a lot of time with and then went to Ghana to see the secondhand market and landfill and waste management in Ghana. That work, along with, I'm a lawyer by background, sister, has led to current work today, which is working on policy as a driver for change. Before writing the book and doing this work, I started a fashion company that was telling a story about how clothes were made, and I realized that venture back company, but we were in competition with other brands that were essentially greenwashing, and it was really hard to tell a story to our customers about like what we were doing was actually legitimate. And so I saw very deeply inside in that the challenges of making sector-wide change when there is so much greenwashing out there. And then in the course of the book and working within, working with brands on their sustainability work, also just seeing how sustainability leaders within companies don't have power and resources within their own companies to really drive change. And so that was when I recalled that I spent a lot of money on a law degree, and that policy, which we've seen in other sectors, this is, as you were saying, in the most labor-intensive sectors, it's actually the least regulated sectors, you know, have enormous climate, environmental, and labor impacts. And so we needed to sort of level the playing field and be able to get the power and resources to sustainability teams to be able to have an actual impact on the ground.
Great. Thank you. And Beth.
Sure. I'm Beth Brewer. I'm here from Baltimore representing T. Rowe Price. It's a global asset management firm. Not to toot our own horn too much, but we have one of the more robust research platforms in the industry. We do everything equity, fixed income, multi-asset. But with that, especially in the day and age that we live in, we also have a very robust ESG team that's done a lot of the same field work, going to Bangladesh and Vietnam. And I'm here basically to share some investment takeaways that we have from that field work, and some takeaways on what we've seen in Bangladesh and Vietnam on the ground floor of these factories and in workers' homes, but also like, what is the future? Like, what can we actually do about this, and how can we implement some of these ideas into making change versus kind of like dwelling on the past in some ways. So, and the reason I'm here, this honestly has nothing to do with my job, but it's more of just a personal interest of mine. I think I watched, I hope this is a little bit relatable, but years ago, I watched a bunch of kind of like fear-mongering documentaries about all of this. And I was like, I care about this. This is something I need to do more about. And I just started questioning everything that I do. Like, what color shirt am I wearing? And where is this dye coming from? What water source is it polluting? Where am I sending my clothes after I'm done with it? Should I be renting? Should I be thrifting? Like, these are all questions that I ask all the time. So I kind of dug into the T. Rowe Price research to share with you guys today.
Thank you. And I realized we didn't introduce ourselves, so we should do that.
Yeah. So I know many of you in this room. My name is Karthik Natarajan. I'm an associate professor of supply chain and operations here at the Carlson School. And I teach a course called Responsible Supply Chain Management, which deals with both the environmental and social aspects of managing today's global supply chains. And I'll jump in a little more as we talk further.
Gosh, now we're looking at ourselves. Sorry, that's really, I didn't want to sit here with Beth staring at a big picture of her face, because like I thought that might, but I don't know how to, whatever. Turn off. We're gonna go to the, we're just gonna do a slide. We'll just do the, here, we'll do our climate change slide. You can look at that one. Okay, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Susanna Gibbons. I'm the director of the Funds Enterprise here at the Carlson School of Management. It is a program where students invest in two different funds, an equity fund and a fixed income fund. And the funds are the only student fund in the world to be a signatory to the Principles for Responsible Investment. And so we have been trying to incorporate ESG issues, or environmental, social, and governance issues, into our investment decision-making for about the past 6 years. One of the advantages that we have that a business does not is that as the world changes and as our understanding of what ESG investing means, we actually will change what we do pretty much every single year. And so we are very adaptive and very iterative in our process. And this whole panel discussion is, for us, an exploration of the ESG issues related to the fashion industry, and how should we be thinking about that when we are making our own investment decisions. So why don't we jump into the.
Yeah, so I love this audience, because one of the questions I got was an amazing question to set the stage for this discussion. So the question was, what is the role of fast fashion within the apparel industry in terms of the environmental and human rights challenges? How would you put the role of fast fashion within the context of apparel? And it doesn't have to be in any order.
Not a good one. I mean, I think I sometimes hesitate in saying that, because it's as if the fast fashion part of the sector is like the only bad actor, when I think might be surprising to learn that a lot of these issues are shared across the sector, not just the fast fashion players. But having said that, I think this business model of introducing clothing on a daily basis, and you have even faster fashion players like Shein that are introducing thousands of new styles a day. That business model is very problematic given what we are seeing right here, and being able to deliver at such a low cost that people could afford to wear their clothing like only once and get rid of it, or not at all, is that they're cutting corners on environmental issues, either climate or chemical management that was discussed earlier, or labor practices. So I think it's, and these players are like taking over market share from from the whole industry. So it's kind of, the whole industry is either moving towards fast fashion, or on the other side, hyper luxury, which is also just demonstrating our income divide that is happening globally and in the United States. So it's not playing a great role, but they're not the only part of the sector that's implicated.
I would just add to that. One of the things that was really a surprising kind of realization for me through my research was realizing that most brands don't own their factories. And so many of these same brands, luxury brands, fast fashion brands, are sometimes made in the same factories. And so it's very difficult to parse out working conditions for one brand versus another. They're really one and the same. And then I would just also emphasize the word fast as being the really operative word here, how much things have sped up in term, and how much that creates competition amongst factories and presses the wages down for these workers. And so these factories are in competition with each other to get the contracts, and it means that they're forced, and that's also a relative term, to pay workers less and less in order to get these contracts. And so that it's about the speed, and it's also about the competition amongst these factories. And so these things are all extremely harmful for workers. And then also it's increasing the number of garments that are being made and produced. And for all the reasons that you suggested earlier about how does the industry contribute to kind of the carbonization of our world, all the things that you mentioned just grow.
So Beth, you had commented, actually, sort of one of the same things that Rachel just mentioned, which is that the same factory is making both the high-end brands and the really inexpensive brands. I don't know if you wanted to add on to that from, there were a couple of pictures that were interesting, but.
Yeah, no, so before I address that, so one thing that I thought was really interesting was just with the fast fashion, the workers are adjusting very quickly to different issues that are happening. So like one issue is like H&M, for example, dropping orders midway through the order, and they're not giving people enough time to find a replacement buyer for it. Even worse, maybe they're using force majeure and canceling the order altogether. So these garment workers are working, you know, it could be H&M, it could be a high fashion brand, but they're being canceled and they're not getting paid for the work that they're doing. So this is like leading to the reason why they aren't getting paid the living wage. And then on the other hand, they are ordering last minute and saying that this is a rush job. We need this fashion created instantly, right? And that's leading them to source from second tier factories that may not have the checks and balances associated. So I think that's really striking about this conversation.
So just if you think in terms of, before we go to what companies are doing, what legislation can do, I just want to ask all of your perspectives on what are some of the biggest barriers that is preventing change from happening within this sector? If there is maybe 2 or 3 things that you think are the biggest barriers, if we clear those, maybe we'll be able to make bigger, faster changes. What comes to your mind in terms of what are the barriers? You can go ahead, yeah. Please.
I think that, I think one of the biggest barriers is the principles that our economic system is currently based on, which is growth and also profit, and how those profits are distributed within a corporate structure. You look at the UAW strike right now, and what's the argument about? It's about the pay. It's about many things, but in part it's about the pay of the workers and the pay of the top executives. So I think that's one of the biggest barriers. And I think there are many. And it's one of the reasons why this is a complicated kind of nut to crack, is because there's not just one answer. If there were just one solution, it would be so much easier. There are many different things. I think one of the most complicated things is the ways that overconsumption has kind of infiltrated our culture. And so it's really difficult for us to rethink how we shop, what we need. It's even hard for us to think about what we need in regards to clothing, but many other things as well. There's some interesting statistics, and you probably know the numbers better than me, but about how many clothes we actually wear that we own. 20%, like 80% of the clothes that we own sit in our closet. We rarely wear them, or we buy things, we don't wear them, we get rid of them. So this kind of whole cultural kind of attitude about how we shop and consume and use our things is also really impacts this. So it's I guess I'll stop there.
And maybe I'll just jump in on that. Looking at the Bangladesh chart again, over the past 20 years, if you go back 20 years, the garment industry was producing 50 million garments a year. Today it is producing 100 million a year. So doubling in the last 7 years. And I think, oh, by the way, the moderators have free reign to jump in and pretend to be panelists. I don't know if you're not like that. That might happen. But I think that going back to the fast fashion question, all of this is just a massive and continual acceleration driven by the things that you have pointed out. And this is not the only industry facing that type of acceleration. But clearly it doesn't seem like it's ending. And so, anyhow, okay, so sorry I'm gonna go back to moderating now, sorry.
Well, I think it's really interesting that we're in a business school, because I do think I went to law school, but I did take classes in the business school because I always like didn't know which path I should take and whatever. But I think that it's business leaders in the future, like what you're doing is hard, right? Because we, business schools have taught that for the past 30, 40 years, that the goal of the business is to make profit and to distribute that profit to shareholders and create shareholder value. And that has been like at least a very good singular job to focus on. And I get that that is how we would structure things, but we are now realizing that that has like a lot of unintended consequences. Namely like the survival of our humanity on this planet. And that we need to really fundamentally rethink what business is for. And as a lawyer, I can tell you that the corporate form was created not to get the most money to executives and shareholders. It was created as the corporate form was created as a tool to pool funds for public works like hospitals and roads. And it was a vehicle in which to do that. So I think we really do have to fundamentally, and it's hard, it's really not easy. I think being in an executive position and thinking about that, that's not an easy thing to do. What, like to actually go back and like, wait, why are we here? What is the purpose? What are we doing here? And so anyway, I think in terms of what is, I think that is why we have fast fashion, it is why we have fast food, it is why we have social media, which is like the fastness of that, of our attention, is because we have been so focused on one singular job, and we have to be, all of you in the room going into your careers are going to have to think about things really differently. And us as lawyers are gonna have to think about what are the smart and thoughtful ways to put bumper guards on our capitalism so that industry can thrive and you can have good jobs and great products, but it isn't going to destroy the planet and its people in the process.
Well said.
And I would just really agree with your point. I think it's a lot of a culture shift that needs to take place, just like people organically thinking different about how they buy and use their clothes. And I also think, to your point about business, like we've gone through so many years of globalization. It's like, how can we source all these different little parts from all these different countries and get the cheapest part from certain countries? And I saw some statistic that said that an average jacket requires 25 different types of material to be made. There's a company under Vanity Fair in Italy who's made a way to find a jacket that only uses one piece. It's just nylon. Every single piece, every zipper, every thread is made out of nylon. And it's like, how can we get more to like a, you know, one type of fabric, one fiber, you know, less globalization and more just like knowing locally where your products are coming from.
I love that you brought up the role of the corporation, because that's something that we have been talking about. The right of a corporation to exist, right? The right of the corporation to exist. It only has a right to exist so long as it is serving society. And there have been many times when we have deemed that corporations have actually stepped over the line. They are no longer serving society and they end up going bankrupt. And you've seen that with things like asbestos. Like we realize, okay, asbestos actually kills people. This company's right to exist as a corporation has essentially been forfeited because of the impacts of its products. We were seeing it right now with the opioid issue. The right of some of those corporations to exist has been challenged because they went over the line. So any investment that we make, any company that we purchase, the first thing that we should be thinking about is what is this company doing to protect its long-term right to exist? And fast fashion as a volume-driven model, it basically accelerates down. Like that's what we're seeing is the only way to continue to grow profits, because that's what we're trying to do, right? Everything has to be growth. The only way to continue to grow profits is to increase volume. And the only way to increase volume is to continue to push on price. And so you all probably, like those of you who may shop, like you go into a store and you have some idea of like what you're looking for, and then you see something that is like on sale or it's cheaper than you thought it was going to be. How many of you might buy that thing? Because I know the hell I would, absolutely. And then you bring it home and then you put it in your closet and you're like, It actually doesn't go with anything. And now I hate it. But you bought it and you bought it because it was cheap. And that is how we get from 50 million articles of clothing to 100 million articles of clothing. Another interesting statistic is if you go back to the beginning of this chart, the average family spent about 10% of their budget on clothing. Now they spend about 3.5% of their budget on clothing. So clothing has gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper because we're chasing price down. So it is a volume-driven model, and that has been accelerating. Are we still in the first question?
We are somewhere in the.
I know.
But it did remind me of an article I saw in the New York Times recently, which talked about the price of a T-shirt. And I think I might have shared with some of you. So in actual dollar amounts, it's actually cheaper. A T-shirt is cheaper today than it was 20 years ago. So it's a fascinating article that gets into what is the reason. It's not that, prices have not gone up. Every other sector has seen a price increase. It's only apparel where the prices are fairly stable across 20 years. So that's something that came to my mind as we were discussing.
Yeah, it may not be the $50 T-shirt, but that's part of why one of the questions we got, and maybe I'll put this to you guys as well. One of the questions from that we got from a student was, all right, but how am I supposed to, if we're going to pay people more, if we're going to pay people a living wage, how can I possibly afford the clothes? Because what happens to the price of clothes if you're paying people a living wage? So I don't know if you want to address the quality versus, and I don't even, quality is the wrong word because as we've just discussed, they're all made in the same place, right? So it's probably not even a quality difference. But if we're going to pay people a living wage, how can we afford our clothes? That's the question that someone put in.
Well, there has been some research done in Sweden about this, and I think it was about an H&M T-shirt, and they said if H&M decided to pay a living wage their garment workers, it would increase the price of a T-shirt by 10 cents. So it's not.
Yep.
This isn't making your T-shirt go from $2 to $200.
Yeah.
It is just that the whole system is not geared towards that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's two pieces to this. And even if the price of our clothes did go up a little more than 10 cents, that might mean that we would need to buy a little less. And I think that our idea about how people afford clothes has to shift a little bit. So with the example that you gave about going to Target and buying, a shirt for $10 because it's cheap. What if that really wasn't an option? And so what if we just bought less and we paid a little bit more? That is an option. I also think that there's a question about how the profits are distributed within the company, going back to how is executive pay managed in comparison to how workers are paid. And that if that formula is changed, that could also change. But that's a big if, I realize, because things are set up in a certain way. I think that we need to really pay attention to these negative externalities that are not accounted for, and can we afford not to change how we are pricing things. These externalities must start to be considered, or we face,
So is everybody familiar with the concept of negative externality? Everybody knows what that is? I mean, that's, basically the full economic cost is not being borne by the consumer of the product. So we're not paying for carbon emissions. We're not actually paying a living wage. And that thing also drives down the price of whatever it is we're buying, which increases consumption. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add to that by saying, I think there is also another distinction between how much the buyer pays and how much actually gets to the workers, right? And there is a lot of challenges within that stream because there is multiple players that go between the buyers and the actual workers, right? So that's also something to keep in mind in terms of reducing those structural barriers to make sure that whatever buyers are paying actually ends up going to the workers who desperately need them and not to the factory owners who might profit more from the buyer paying actually more.
Okay, so this chart, I pulled this randomly from the internet. I have actually no idea who Everlane is, but there's a lot of statistics out there that are like, that will talk about like how much of the price of any article of clothing actually makes it to the workers. And here is like 5%, could be 3%. So you could literally double what you are paying a garment worker, and it will have almost no impact on the final price that you are paying for that good. It's not going to send you into a different price point at all. So the things that would move an article of clothing into a different price point are not the living wage. It's brand, and one of the reasons, by the way, if you look at why Bangladesh has not grown as much as a country like South Korea in terms of their economic profitability, the economic value added of their activities is actually not having a significant impact on the overall productivity of that system. If you are looking at retail and fashion, most of the high value jobs from an economic standpoint are actually here, right? So that was part of what we did out there in our little exercise. We had one finance manager, right? And so things like finance, marketing, those are the jobs that get paid a ton. That's where the real cost of your product is. It's not the garment worker who's driving the cost.
No, I would just say, I love everything that you're saying. Like, I don't think anybody asked for fast fashion. Nobody was like, I need a $5 shirt. Like, this is what I need as my priority in the world, right? So like, we'll gladly pay the extra 10 cents or 90 cents or whatever it is to double the cost, like the living wage of these people, right? But I also feel like it comes a lot as like a grassroots movement. For like Everlane, for example, is this great company. They are tracking the sustainability of all their
Thank you.
garments.
So you know them.
I know
Okay,
them.
good.
Yeah, no, they're great. And I think of them as kind of like the gold source for tracking and making sure. But it's like, we have to do our homework, and that's a lot of work, right? It's like, do I really want to do all this work to just buy a shirt that I have to wear to my meeting tomorrow? It's like, not everybody has time for that. But I think there are a lot of companies like Everlane and plenty of other like Shops as an example. It's like a boutique where you can go in and say, I want to make sure that this doesn't have anything to do with human rights violations, or I want to buy from female-owned companies, and you can kind of like pick and choose what you want to buy from. But I think there are a lot of like sporadic movements around this, but it would be great to kind of like have one gold source for everything.
Did you?
Yeah, go ahead. Just to, so I think part of the challenge of that is even companies like an Everlane or a Patagonia or all the ones I think of that are like really invested in this space, like they are not without, they are still part of the system, and it is still hard for them. So I think that, yeah, it is challenging to say like shop here versus here as a solution. It's obviously like part of what one can think about in that. But they are also sharing facilities with other brands, and it is kind of it's like a system. Their Everlane happens to be an endorser of the Fashion Act as Patagonia, because they realize like in order for us to actually meet our own goals, this has to be common across the industry, because we share facilities with other brands that might not have the same goals as we do.
Oh my God, what a mess. So basically you're telling me that this is all like balled up into one thing and very hard to extract.
It's like the yes and. I mean, I think it's like, I don't know, for me personally, the way in which like I consume is that I focus a lot on like, I like style, like stylists, and learning from them, and using my closet as like an invitation to like my clothing, as opposed to absorbing the marketing messages that are being pushed at me. I tend to find that that is like, even if it's marketing of like, this is super sustainable, because you're not planting trees, so it's not. So that, I mean, so I think that's how I approach it, as opposed to like, oh, that I need to buy from sustainable companies, so I'm gonna like look at XYZ thing. I think both solutions should exist out there, but my own way of like slowing down my consumption and actually really liking what's in my closet for the first time ever, is just getting to know my own body and getting
Yeah.
to know like what I, like the uniforms that I wear for work or for different events in my life. And that has made me feel much more in control of my own purchases and feel better about it, regardless of how the product is marketed towards.
So maybe two ideas that I want to unpack from that.
And
Rachel, please
wanna
jump
throw-
in.
I want to
Yeah.
throw a few other things. There was this really great article in the New Yorker a while ago, maybe 5 years ago, about Patagonia, and they were being very transparent, and they told this story about I think they had some plants in Taiwan, and there was a problem with how workers were being brought to the factory. There was a worker shortage in Taiwan, and so they were actually relying on people to recruit workers from other countries, and it was very exploitive, and Patagonia did not know, and then they realized it, and I think made some changes to kind of correct those wrongs. But it was a really good example of how, and these are such big systems, it's impossible for these companies oftentimes to really regulate them completely and make sure that certain laws are not being broken or certain policies are being upheld. And then there's one other thing I wanted to say, I guess. Another way that I look at kind of shopping, like my husband wanted to buy a rice cooker. So he did all this research. He loves Wirecutter, thinks it's like the best website in sliced bread.
Say rice
A rice cooker.
or rice cooker.
Wanted a rice cooker. On Wirecutter, looking at reviews, and he does all this research. And a rice cooker is not that expensive. He was spending $30. I don't, it's not a lot of money. So if we spend time researching the clothes that we want, instead of these kind of like, oh, I'm at the store and here's a $5 thing, it's a different way of thinking. I also want to say, and we can come back to this, I don't know if this makes sense for the conversation right now, this kind of thinking about our individual habits is a really great thing, and it's also not going to change the things that we really want to see changed. It's a part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. And I think this idea that a lot of us have been sold that if we just buy this one thing, everything's going to be fine, especially like this more sustainable thing. And if we don't buy it, we're the problem, is really not a helpful way to look at things. And so I'm really very interested in how we think about collective social change, how we think about legislative action, which I think is such a key part of that. But there are so many ways for us to impact things collectively. And that's really the thing that I think about in terms of solutions.
Yeah. So was it maybe the collective action brings us to the Fashion Act and then also the Uyghur Act, and I'm hoping maybe we can unpack those things a little bit. So anybody, I'm looking at Maxine because like she's like,
But also just
yeah, please.
piggybacking off of that. So I thought maybe it's if you can broaden the question a little bit, right? So in terms of solutions, so the legislation is one part of the solution. So individual companies are acting. There is definitely room for legislation. And then there's also the third piece, which is looking at, and the legislation is also getting to some of that, which is what is the role of traceability technology, and basically making sure we know what the supply chain looks like, who's making our clothes, how it's getting made, and basically what happens after we dispose our clothing, right? So beyond, legislation is an important piece. I definitely want to talk about that. But if there is also thoughts on the role of technology, traceability in this, that would be great.
Definitely. So I think the systems change, and my sort of theory of change is it's going to be kind of three things coming together. It's going to be leaders, whether they are within companies or within legislative leaders that recognize that this is something that needs rules around it, and that requires leadership. I think it's going to be technology. And I find what is interesting, the people that want this, the Fashion Act, which is one I work most closely with, pass the most are probably the technology companies, sustainability teams within brands, and then of course the people working on the front lines in the garment industry. Because when laws that mandate traceability come into force, then their technologies will be more widely adopted. And basically what is happening without legislation is all of these technologies, whether they're traceability technologies or innovative fibers or dyeing technologies that reduce the need for dyes, which ends up having a very helpful impact on the carbon reductions. I think somebody in this part of the room was talking about how the carbon footprint is in the production of the material, which this Everlane, as great as they are, like the hotspot, the carbon hotspot is actually not even like an image here. The carbon hotspot in apparel production is between that cotton bud and the cutting. Is the actual textile creation process is where 75% of the carbon footprint is. But all of these innovations are in pilot mode because as soon, like, it's really cool to put in an ESG report, like, oh, this is the thing that we've invested in to put in our ESG report, but not like, this is the thing that we are now rolling out across our entire company because that might add a penny to the bottom line. And so then, sorry, that gets to the two pieces of legislation, I guess the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA, that is on the federal level, that is law already. That is requiring that apparel companies demonstrate that the products entering the US market are not from Uyghur forced labor. So if they're coming from certain brands or a certain area, there is basically a presumption of guilt, and companies have to demonstrate that it is not coming from that area. Companies like Oratane, which is a technology company that can test natural fibers and determine their origin, like basically almost like by very small farm plot of land. They are, I think, like an official partner of the federal agency responsible for enforcement. So they're doing incredibly well as a result of that piece of legislation. And then the Fashion Act is, it's a state piece of legislation introduced in New York, also be introduced in the state of Minnesota. But basically it is trying to do what the California fuel efficiency standards did for the auto industry, which is essentially create a floor for how clothing that is sold in the New York market are going to be produced, would be produced. So the companies that are reached, it's a state bill, but would have global implications because it is for any basically fashion brand that has global revenue over $100 million that wishes to sell into the state of New York. So global implications. It will require that the companies through all 4 tiers of their production, 4 years, determine and share where their production is actually taking place in facilities. I think that's one thing we haven't talked about. A lot of companies don't know when their production is taking place. Like in the past 5 years, like now they know their tier 1, the cut and sew, but of course, like this part is, as you mentioned, like the very last part in a very long line of a production line. And so they don't know beyond like where their cut and sew is, where their textile is made, certainly like not where their polyester oil rig is. So it would require that disclosure, but then that is really the prerequisite to do the work, because knowing is just the first step. Like you have to do something about that impact, and it would require basically putting law behind what have been voluntary initiatives in the industry. So a lot of companies are signing up for science-based targets. Who's familiar with science-based targets? Okay, so science-based targets is Science-Based Targets Initiative. It is run by several NGOs that it's spinning off into its own organization, but it it sets the methodology for how a company would reduce their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. So essentially reducing their emissions in line with planetary boundaries. So the law would require that companies do that, that they manage their chemicals using another methodology that the industry has voluntarily signed up for, the zero discharge hazardous chemicals, and then has a broader due diligence that includes purchasing practices, which is another thing we haven't talked about, which is why these outcomes are happening, is that the brands are not paying sufficiently and not on the terms, on the, like they're canceling orders, as you mentioned. They're doing all sorts of unhealthy purchasing practices, which is creating the results that we're seeing. So it would require due diligence. And then if a garment worker is not in receipt of their due wages, which is what's happening with all these order cancellations, then a garment worker could bring a case against a brand, and the brand would have to prove that they had done sufficient due diligence and effective purchasing practices. That's what.
Thank you.
So we've got maybe about 5 minutes, and we wanted to leave some time for questions also. So maybe it would give everybody one last chance to address something, not individuals, because I know, like, and Rachel and I have talked about this a little bit, trying to move from like what you as an individual can do, which we talked a little bit about, but really from a system standpoint, what do you think would be the most effective thing to focus on? And I'm gonna start with picking on Beth because from an investment standpoint, like that's what we in the funds, like, okay, as an investor, how do I shape my investment strategy or my own due diligence to have a positive impact? And then maybe go with Maxine and Rachel to like what systemic things can we do?
Right. Well, I will start by saying, like, so when I think about the investment side, there's like the ESG investment side, and then there's like the actual investment thesis. But from the ESG side, I was actually really shocked to learn that we don't consider any fashion to be sustainable. Like if I was building an impact fund today and I wanted to include the fashion sector, there's not a single investment that I would put in that from the fashion, or that our ESG team would put in there that's truly sustainable, but also we think could have increased revenues for the fund, right? I mean, there are certainly companies that are like meeting certain targets towards the regulation that you're talking about. Like we look at like Adidas and Lululemon, and this is not an investment recommendation, but just like companies that we think might potentially meet these targets at some point. So there are, green shoots out there, but as of right now, it's not looking too promising. But I guess what we do look for is just like traits that these companies are moving in the right direction. So like the traceability topic, companies are looking at using blockchain to trace, and the isotope technology that we were talking about earlier. We're looking at one company, not to invest in them directly, but looking to see if fashion companies are investing in like 3D printing ink kind of solutions that don't require any water usage when they're printing, and that it's all sustainable dyes. So like, how are these companies thinking outside of the box? Those are the companies that we want to invest in, who are actually making efforts to move the needle a little bit here.
Maxine, anything to add? Because you've talked a little bit, I mean, you talked about the Fashion Act and the impact that would have. But
legislation and advancing this legislation in other states, certainly.
Okay.
Great.
How many people here are in Susanna's investment fund class? So my big question for all of you is, like, you guys can play a huge role. You have a huge role to play. And so the questions are, to what extent can the way these investment funds work be pushed? Can, for instance, you choose to invest in a fund that where the bottom line is not as long as it makes a profit? Can you invest in a fund that has a different top priority? I don't know, or does that require a question to the board? I know there's a board that manages the funds, right? So how do you speak to those people and say, this criteria is unacceptable? can that be done? If anybody can do it, it's you, it's not me. So in what's the strategy? I don't know, but that's the question or the charge that I would ask of you.
I would totally answer that, because I think I speak to a lot of companies, and the thing that motivates executives is either their children or young professionals coming in, like, and just you have a lot more power in that than you are led to believe. And asking questions is a great way of like yielding that power. And it does, I've seen on the other side of it, it moves the industry forward. So bringing up those questions, even if it feels weird and it is against the culture of the space, like that's the leadership that we all like need in these times. So, very much agree. And then also like, just, I think ESG, like asking those fundamental questions is really important, because also if we're like trying to compete in returns at the same time, like this stuff costs money and we can't pretend that it doesn't. So we should be thinking about like returns differently.
Sure, okay. Let's open up and see if there's any questions from the group. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious how many people in this room have knit a garment that you still wear, sew a garment that you still wear, or have woven fabric that could be made into a garment? Raise your hand if any of those apply.
No kidding. Got a lot of knitters in here.
My question is, I teach sewing classes and I wear clothing that I've made, and I don't make my living off of that. I work at the U in an office job. And I'm curious, why is there not a discussion about investing people's time in the skills and the knowledge and the craft of making clothing? If we are the consumers who are driving the market that increases this fast fashion industry and like pushes that fast fashion industry to exist, like, what about legislation to incorporate these skills that people used to have not that long ago, where they would wear the same coat for generations or pass on the same shoes because they knew how to repair and make them? Like, does that seem like?
I'll let the
it's not
panelists.
It's not the responsibility of the individual consumer to solve this problem,
Yeah.
but like, I feel really passionate about that.
I want the panelists to address that, but I would like to point out I was actually really surprised at our event today, at our sewing event, that there were students at all who had actually, like in 6th grade, oh yeah, we had to learn how to use a sewing machine. We had to learn how to do this. Nobody had done since. It was at least a tiny little effort as part of the, education, but it wasn't very focused. It was just, how do we use a machine? So what do you think?
I think, like I said earlier, I think there are lots of solutions, and I think if people feel like they can make their own clothes, that can be really rewarding, and that's great. But I would also go back to what I said earlier too, which is that individually, everybody's not going to do that. It's a great idea, but I think that most people won't use their skills to make clothes. And so while whoever can do it, that's great. And also there's this bigger systemic thing that still needs to be addressed on a policy level, on a systems change level. And I think I guess it's a little bit like Maxine said, it's both and. So yes, and there's other things that really need to be addressed too. And I think about, even if that happened, there's still going to be a lot of workers working in really horrible conditions, and that needs to change. And it won't change only by everybody knitting their own sweater. That's my answer.
I'm all for home ec. I think like education in a really true way. Like I think education of this young generation is going to be about like what makes us human as we move into the world of AI and like gardening, tactile things.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I think has happened as a society is we have been separated from some of the essential elements of what anthropologists would think of as culture. Right? Clothing is an essential element of culture, and we've been separated from it. We've been separated from art. We have been separated from music. And so maybe reclaiming some of those essential elements of culture could be part of it, even if it's not solving it. really reclaiming some of our culture.
Can I just add one quick
Yeah.
point to that? So this is something I frequently talk about. We also have to think about the unintended consequences, right? So what happens to those apparel workers in the case where we are all sewing and making our own clothes? So I think that is something to also think about. What would happen to those workers? What happens to their living conditions? So that's another perspective to keep in mind.
That's the hard part, is unwinding something. You can't just go back as though it had never happened. It's happened. And so it's moving forward. Other questions? Yes.
How do you guys like envision kind of accountability taking form place, you know, in those like overseas kind of like environments of like where this exploitation is happening, you know, obviously like kind of like what you guys mentioned, like these companies like here in the US, like they know like where their cut and sew is, but like beyond that, they don't know, and like it's a little out of their control, but like something does have to be done about that. Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's not outside of their control. They can know it, they just don't. So putting things into legislation that would require that. And then you have a lot of technology companies that facilitate that knowing process. So it's, I think, making that a requirement of law so that there is more accountability.
I think the other piece is really supporting unions in these other countries. It's really absolutely essential that we support unions so that women in these factories have agency and have a vehicle for expressing their dissatisfaction and challenging problems. Right now, in many countries, unions are illegal, or it's actually very difficult for women to join unions. They're beaten, they're harassed if they try to join, or they're fired. And so, and at the same time, the unions are important. Sometimes they support women even if the women aren't members, and because they provide education to women about their rights. I met with an organization in India, and one of the things that the staff was saying is that, you know, women are beaten if they don't meet their targets, but they think if they don't, that many of them believe that if they haven't met their targets, they should be beaten. Like it's like their fault. And so there's this, that the unions play a huge role in educating them about, no, that's not acceptable. You should not be beaten if you don't meet your targets. So I just really am a strong advocate that we should do what we can from here to support the unionization, the movement in these other countries. And there are ways to, I mean, financially support them, and that's the best thing we can do.
No, so I would agree. It comes from regulation. It comes from putting pressure on the companies. It's all about like unannounced audits and telling the companies like you need to be going in there unannounced and taking a look at what's actually happening. Like when the T. Rowe Price team came and toured the H&M factory in Bangladesh, like they had everything wrapped up. It painted it in such a great light. And they're like, no, we want to see what's really going on. Like, is this a reflection of the hotlines and the audits that are taking place? So, and it's also about like knowing the high risk areas too. And we were talking earlier about just like cultural differences. So like Vietnam, for example, is attracting a lot of foreign direct investment. So naturally there's people in these factories who don't speak Vietnamese, and they're yelling at people and sexually harassing them, and nobody's reporting it because it's just not built into their structure in the country to report these things. But it's like, we're telling H&M, you know, come on, you have to be get these people to report, hold them accountable. But it's like, we're not really considering. I would love to hear your thoughts on that too, about just like the cultural differences and the barriers that are there. It's like, how do we get past the cultural differences in order to like actually make the change happen?
Yeah, so I think my broad take on that is, you know, it's really important to be cognizant of the local culture and context when understanding what constitutes a violation, what is considered accepted practice. So there is, and I think that's where there's a lot of tension between the global standard versus what is okay in a local context, right? And I think companies do struggle because they think of it in terms of black and white, whereas it's much more nuanced on the ground. And I'll also say that audits are good, but they are a very imperfect tool, right? And I think that's a lot of companies use audits as a way of saying everything is great, nothing to see here, but it's mostly staged, when they know that an auditor is coming in. So just being mindful of that is also important.
Okay, so when people start leaving, we realize, okay, we have gone past 5. We did promise we'd go to 5. Maybe we'll take one more question and then we're going to just invite you to the Financial Markets Lab, which is directly across the 3M auditorium for some light refreshments. And of course, you can visit what we're calling our factory floor, so you can see where we were working on our art project for the day. So maybe if there's one more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to shift gears a bit to the environmental issues surrounding this, that's climate change. So people who try to downplay the effects of climate change have made examples of things like, hey, over the last 200 years, temperatures have only increased less than 2 degrees or something like that every 1 to 2 decades. And because of that, the kind of investment that needs to go into protecting us against climate change is sort of not the effective allocation of resources right now. I just wanted to hear from the panel, including Kartik and Susanna, what your thoughts are around that.
So that's why I put this chart in here, because I love this chart. I love this chart for 2 reasons. First of all, it is from NASA. Right? So this is not, NASA is not known for being like a left-wing radical organization. It's just a bunch of astronauts. And so they've put together this chart, which is like, this is not a question of, oh, over the last 200 years, you know, temperatures drifted slightly higher. It's like, no, we've had a radical shift since industrialization that has had a fairly dramatic impact on the climate. And so the problem with people who maybe talk about, oh, it's only, you know, 1 degree, or it's only 1.5 degrees, that number has no context, right? If you're going to talk about something as having 1.5 degrees, well, is that a lot or is it a little? In our minds, it doesn't sound like very much, but we've already seen the economic impacts have been already fairly devastating. So I don't, and okay, I'm just going to put these 2 QR codes up here so that you can, if you want to learn more about them. This will bring you to a chart on the NASA website that just shows basically record high global temperatures for the past 20 years. So if anybody wants to snap that QR code, you can do that. Or we'll share it afterwards. And then the other one, can I go to the next screen? Okay. So what's the big deal? This also is from NASA, and it basically goes into all of the different economic impacts, right? And so we don't have enough time to go into all the economic impacts, but I would say to anybody who is arguing about the size of temperature change and why it's not worth the investment, they're looking at that number without context. And so I like looking at it in the context of 800,000 years of history of the planet. That's useful context. We are clearly outside of where we have been. And then understanding what the real impacts are, given what seems to us to be very small. Like we're like, oh, 72 degrees, you know, yesterday, and then 70 degrees today. It's not that big a difference, right? But we're talking about, you know, levels of atmospheric carbon that are fundamentally altering planetary systems. And so you have to look at the impacts rather than just look at that number without context. So I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
No, I'll just add
And
to-
then you guys can jump in if you want to jump in on climate change.
I'll just add to that by saying, I think when we talk about these kinds of macro effects, I think talking about averages, talking about having a global discussion, to me is not very salient, because to somebody who's on the water, I think it makes a much bigger difference than somebody who's inland, right? So it really depends on who we are talking about, who is the stakeholder, and what is the impact for them. So for that person, it may not matter what happens to everybody else. They might be facing the impact of climate change that maybe 100 others don't actually feel, right? So to me, it's a very personal conversation in terms of who is going to be impacted and what is the impact for that particular person, rather than sort of a global conversation on this is the aggregate impact for everybody in the state or everybody in this country, because the impacts are going to be so different depending on where you are, what you do for your livelihood. So I think all of that matters. So that would be my response.
And that's sort of the essence of a negative externality, right? The cost is borne by someone who may have had nothing to do with the purchase of that decision, or maybe they did, but the costs are not shared proportionate with whoever is using a particular product. They are distributed in a different way. Anybody, yeah, if anybody else wants to jump in on climate change? Anything to add? Okay, all right. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our panelists. Can we please give them a really Thank you to everybody for participating. We will be meeting across the hall in the Financial Markets Lab. Please stop by, say hello, learn more about our program, and enjoy our, we'll call it our guerrilla art exhibit.
Thanks, everybody.